Hello, I'm Jeff McKinney, and I'm doing my final paper presentation on the impact of the Russian Orthodox Church on the native people of Alaska, 1741 until 1912. On July 15th, 1741, Alex Cherikov, commander of St. Paul, one of the ships of the Second Bering Expedition, recorded sighting what had been assumed to be Lewinsky Inlet on the northwest coast of Chichagof Island. He reported a broad harbor at 57 degrees 15 minutes north latitude. 10 armed men in a longboat were sent ashore to explore the land. Days passed and the men failed to return. A second boat went out, but it too disappeared. Smoke from fires on shore could be seen, but 3 weeks passed and nothing was seen of the missing men. Some of the natives in two small canoes paddled out from the bay where the boats had gone. When Cherikov tried to entice the people in the canoes to come aboard St. Paul, both canoes turned away. On July 27th, Cherikov and his officers decided to return to Kamchatka, which is in Asia. St. Paul had no small boats left, and without them it was impossible to send parties ashore to obtain critically needed fresh water. As an aside to this, during the readings, particularly in Russell, on page 232 of our readings from the American Indian Quarterly, volume 33, number 2, spring 2009, which goes from pages 230 to 253. Mark Jacobs Jr., a man who I've met and in fact congratulated me in 1996 after I joined the the Alaska Native Brotherhood in Sitka. So I've met him. He's a Tlingit elder, and he recounted the Tlingit version of this story. These stories are very, very well known among the Tlingit people regarding this particular crew of Alex Cherikov, and they, of course, had a different version that we read in our readings just a couple of weeks ago. So, according to Mike Jacobs Jr., who I know to be of Sitka, these three men did not return to their ship. They took this opportunity to escape the cruel and harsh conditions of the Russian ship. As they left the ship, they decided amongst themselves that they would eventually perish in the hazardous waters of the North Pacific. Why suffer such a cruel command until then? The decision to desert was easy. They eventually made contact with some local natives and were accepted and treated with respect instead of being murdered as Russian history tells it. So this is a little aside from what I've always understood that happened to those men. So again, this is the Tlingit version. I happen to know Mr. Mark Jacobs Jr., and so he continued that they married Tlingit women, and all went well until they spotted another Russian ship approaching. They explained that they would be shot or hanged if they were ever captured, so there was a hasty preparation to load them, as well as their family, into the canoes that were provided to them. Their offspring became some of the most prominent families in the village of Klowak. Now, Alexei Cherikov was the commander of the St. Paul in the same expedition of Vitus Bering. The Bering expedition had two ships, and the other ship was the St. Peter, which was actually commanded by Bering himself. Of course, the Bering Straits of Alaska were named after him. Now, in 1741, then, Vitus Bering mapped the coast of Alaska. It happened that on that expedition that they became split from each other, and so Alexei Chirikov's St. Paul was separate at the time when the men left the ship and never returned. It was the same expedition, but he was separated by that time from Vitus Bering in the St. Peter. And so they continued on their own missions separately. And so, again, Vitus Bering mapped the coast of Alaska, and he discovered the richness of the furs in this part of America that resulted in the Russian Russian men coming over to the American continent, basically because of the furs, the riches that the furs brought. So these common men, the Shalinki, brought many things with them, and they brought with them their religious traditions. And some of them were Orthodox, and it was these Orthodox laypersons in bringing their Orthodox faith to North America who baptized the first North American converts. And remember, this began shortly after 1741. So, in continuation of our story, we go to Grigory Shelikov. He was the chief of the Northeastern American Company, and of course, he was interested in the profits that these furs could bring. But he's also interested in the native people themselves, and he wanted to treat the native people with as much tenderness and goodwill as possible. And he sincerely seemed to want to help the native people. So in the summer of 1874, Commander Shelikov shipped out from Russia for Kodiak Island. Shelikov believed that sending annual expeditions to America for trade was both expensive and dangerous. So he actually was there with the plan on establishing a permanent base so that he wouldn't have to travel back and forth. And his expedition, of course, met resistance from the local Kodiak Aleuts. So Kodiak, of course, is about 900 miles due west of Sitka. So they didn't go as far as Sitka now. They're back in Kodiak. And Kodiak, of course, is the land of the Aleuts. These are not Indians the way that we think of Indians. The Aleuts are an entirely different people. And again, they're about 900 miles from Sitka. They encountered difficulties as far as fights with the locals. And so Shelikov returned to St. Petersburg in Russia and requested a monopoly for the fur trade. So Gregory Shelikov was indeed granted the monopoly, but he never returned to Alaska himself. He set off to find missionaries to accompany, basically to set up in Kodiak for the benefit of the native people. Shelikov went to a place called Valum in Russia. Now it's part of Finland, is my understanding. But in any case, it was obviously far in the northwestern part of Russia. And he was able to come up with a series of both clergy and lay people to go to Kodiak. So Alexander Baranov went instead of Shelikov to Kodiak, and he was there to. He was given instructions to treat the native people with as much tenderness as goodwill as possible. However, when the monks and lay people actually arrived in Kodiak in 1794, they were very shocked and surprised at how badly Baranov's Russian-American company were treating the Aleuts of Kodiak at the time of their arrival. They were so shocked and surprised at how the native people were being treated that in 1796, a group went back to St. Petersburg to report on the treatment, but they never made the trip back. The next year, as they approached Kodiak, they were struck by tragedy, and they perished. However, some of the clergy stayed, and one of the monks who stayed was a monk named by the name of Herman, who in the Orthodox Church is now considered to be Saint Herman, who stayed on and for many years ministered to the native people of Kodiak and the surrounding islands. Saint Herman Monk Herman himself went to Spruce Island, which is adjacent to Kodiak Island, and that's pretty much where he spent the rest of his life, working, ministering with, and educating the Kodiak native people. So Alexander Baranov, he has an entire history himself. He ended up moving over to Sitka, and there's actually a lot of history with he and the Tlingit Indians. He established his post with with the Russian American company in Sitka. He retired, and in 1818, he ended up going back, or at least attempting to go back to Russia. He never made it. He perished on the journey back to Russia. And in 1824, Father John Veniaminov came over, basically to be a priest in Russian America. Father Veniaminov was probably the central figure during this time period that I've given. As I mentioned, he came over in 1824. He came with his wife, his mother, and his brother, and they actually set up. After arriving in Sitka, they went back to Kodiak, and that's where he began. He ended up going back to Unalaska and building the first chapel there. One of the things that Bishop, well, I should say Father Veniaminov is known most for is his translations. Um, he was able to understand the Aleut language. He's learned a particular dialect of Eastern Aleut that was used in the District of Unalaska, and he used that to develop a language. Um, Father Veniaminov created an alphabet based on the Russian Cyrillic, um, but adding some more signs to show the aspirated character of some of the consonants. And he placed the word accents and that sort of thing in his, doing redoing the script for the Aleut dialect of Unalaska. So Father Veniaminov was to get help. Later, in 1828, another priest came. He himself was a Creole, meaning that he was part Russian. His dad was Russian, and his mother was native. Um, Father Jacob Netsitov was a Creole of Aleut and Russian ancestry, and he graduated from the Irkutsk Seminary. Irkutsk, of course, is part of Siberia in Russia now. And so his, he was sent back to Irkutsk to study. And then after he was ordained, he was sent to assist Father Veniaminov in the evangelization of the Aleutian Islands. Saint Jacob, as he is known in the Orthodox Church, was born in 1804 at St. George. His dad had been one of the first Russian workers sent to St. George Island, and so Jacob himself spent his early years at St. George preparing for studies in the seminary that I spoke of in Siberia. So as time went on with the important work of translations of the native script into basically scriptural script, in other words, translations of the Gospels and some of the works of St. Paul, the Apostle, were taken from Russian and put into the native scripts. There were other Creole priests that came down the line. Father Veniaminov, who eventually became bishop of the territory, insisted that all of the priests of that area be bilingual, which pretty much necessitated that they be of both Russian and Aleut origin. Bishop Innocent was alive until his proposal actually was in 1879. So he was alive um, when the United States purchased what was Russian America and, of course, became Alaska. He was actually for the purchase because, in his mind, it would allow um, the Americans basically to be introduced to the Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is a branch of Christianity that was actually aligned with the Roman Catholic Church up until the year 1054. And so it's not an obscure branch of Christianity, but in North America, basically Catholicism is known as Roman Catholicism, um, but it's not the only type of Catholicism that exists in the world. As I mentioned, Orthodoxy and the Roman Catholic Church were basically one church for the first 1,000 years after Jesus Christ himself. And so I mentioned this with regards to Catholicism because, of course, the United States is predominantly a Protestant um, nation. Protestantism is a predominant form of Christianity in the United States, and I'm making that distinction between Catholicism and Protestantism because, of course, after 1867, there were Protestant um, evangelists who came from the lower 48 up into Alaska, and they basically wanted to abolish the influence to as much as possible of the Orthodox Church. And so some of the major people at the time of the turn of the century um, were the Reverend S. Hall Young and the Reverend Sheldon Jackson. I know of the name Sheldon Jackson because when I first went to Sitka, there was a college that was in full form, students, and they were pretty much running up. They were pretty much a running college when I got to Sitka in the mid 1990s. So Sheldon Jackson, the man, was the first general agent for education in Alaska, and he determined the direction of public school policy from 1885 until 1906. Jackson became active in Alaska in 1877 and was determined to establish mission schools as Protestant forts to protect the natives from the military, as well as from sourdoughs and bootleggers. So one of Jackson's, Mr. Reverend Sheldon Jackson's philosophies were two fundamental goals: the establishment of Protestantism in Alaska and the replacement of all native languages with English only. American missionaries and federal officials alleged that the Orthodox clergy opposed the introduction of English, but as early as 1871, the process of adapting the curriculum uh, at the Orthodox to English had begun. In 1910, however, federal agents at St. Paul were still complaining that the only 5 or 6 Aleuts that could speak English well and continued to blame the Orthodox school and Aleut parents for insisting on the use of Aleut in village affairs. Sometime before 1916, the government forcibly closed the Orthodox parish school. Circa 1912, the U.S. government closed the Orthodox Church School of St. Paul Pribilovs by force for the crime of speaking Aleut. There will be no natives teaching native or native languages, was the policy.